Now that we have finished our introduction to chemistry, we're ready to move into the next sort of realm of science, the next sort of level up, the biological world, which is heavily dependent upon chemistry. And so we're basically looking at how chemistry and all the things we learn there sort of become the science of biology, which is the study of large, complex systems that involve all kinds of chemistry. And so if we think about what we've learned so far, we've learned about ionic compounds, what those are, how they work, and we've learned about covalent bonding. And so we've learned a little bit about how chemicals interact, how atoms interact with each other. Covalent bondings, right, which is what we produce. We produce molecules this way. So we have ionic compounds and molecules, and we know how to sort of form them, and we can understand that atoms are seeking to fill their outer orbits in some way, and there's trading and stealing and sharing, and we've learned all that. And in the process, we've come to see some interesting molecules, like carbon dioxide, for example, or oxygen gas, or perhaps water, which is very common, right? We've also learned about things like, magnesium hydroxide. And although we've spent a lot of time talking about how to write their names and formulas and how these bonds are actually occurring, here's calcium bromide, we haven't talked a whole lot about what happens next. What happens with these? How do you go from these interesting things, here's iron 3 sulfate, how do you go from that to a dog? There's a big leap there. There's a big step. How do you go from that to a tree? Where is this intermediate thing that happens? And so what we have to do is take a few minutes to understand how these little molecules and compounds and things, how they might become bigger things. Now, even though these are little, you'll notice that these things I've drawn here, they have only a few atoms, right? A few atoms. Some of them have only 2, like oxygen. 2 atoms, that's all it is. Some of them are quite a bit bigger, like this one, which has, 17 atoms, I think. Right? But still, we're still under 20 atoms, which is nothing, really. It's a very small group of atoms clumping together. And as a result, these small molecules, they have very limited shapes that they can take. And so one of the key things to remember as chemistry becomes biology is the concept of shape. The shape of a molecule becomes very important because it's what determines what that molecule is going to be able to do. Shape is critically important in biochemistry, the chemistry of biological systems and larger things. And of course, the only way you can have interesting shapes is if the molecules get bigger with many atoms, maybe 50 atoms or 100 atoms, or even maybe in some weird cases, thousands of atoms grouped together. I'm not sure exactly how high you can go. The largest molecules known would probably be, I'm thinking, some proteins, and there would easily be many hundreds of atoms in a protein. So then you get some really cool shapes that can occur. And so even these small ones, though, what we notice is, remember there's a reason why these things have formed. And it's all because atoms have one simple little rule, right? One simple little desire. The rule of atoms. We can call it that sort of for fun. It's not an official term. But the rule is they all want to fill their outer orbit. Because filling the outer orbit somehow confers a certain stability. Now, that's a simple way of putting it. As you go further in your studies, you'll be able to maybe say that more technically. And you'll be talking about, things like energy and entropy and the energy levels of electrons and all the different bond energies and the way that they fit together. But essentially, when we're beginning, we understand that this reason here is the entire reason why all these things form. even the dog in the tree, to be honest. And we'll get to that. Because before you can form a dog, you have to form these small things. And even these small things have very interesting properties. They can do some pretty amazing things that sort of emerge. We call them emergent properties, where, they get together, they form a compound or a molecule, and all of a sudden, a whole new level of something occurs. I'm going to give you an example when we look at water. Water is a very simple molecule. 2 H's, 2 hydrogens, and an oxygen. And when we look at it, if we try to draw it with a Lewis picture, oxygen bonds like this, the problem with the Lewis picture is it doesn't give us a very good indication of the 3D effect. This is what it looks like when you squash it onto a flat surface, but water itself doesn't quite look like this. The 4 bonds, or the 4 sort of electron pairs around the oxygen, are situated in a 3D sort of tetrahedral shape, which is very hard to draw, right? It's very hard to draw in a 2D form. So what we can do is we can sort of make a sort of reasonable compromise. When you look at a water molecule, it's got more of this shape to it, this bent shape. And that's because you have to account for the 3D effect. Now, that's interesting, but here's what's really interesting. The idea of the polar covalent bond. We learn about that and everybody thinks, oh yeah, whatever, that's just something we learn and we have to memorize it and blah, blah, blah. That little thing is basically what's responsible, or what's behind, almost all of the things that happen in biology. It's a very simple concept, but it's so important because of the emergence properties, the emergent processes that come out of that. So let me show you what I mean. If we imagine what happens here with this water, we know that the oxygen is pulling stronger on the electrons than the hydrogens. So these electrons that are being shared in these pairs that I'm coloring in green, what that really means is the electrons are spending far more time here than they are over here or over here. And what that means is that there's sort of a line we can sketch down the middle here. If there are more electrons spending more time around the oxygen, because it's a polar covalent bond, right? It's an unequal sharing. That means we develop what we call a polarity. So we put a little sigma and a minus here to show where there are more electrons gathering, and here a sigma plus to show where there are less electrons gathering. What's interesting, though, is this is not a charged ion, because it's still a neutral object. You can think of it like a room full of boys and girls. And if we call neutral the same number of boys and girls, and we just throw them all around here, so there we go, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 boys, so put another girl, we would say this room is neutral. But it's all jumbled around. But it's possible to take a neutral room with 4 boys and 4 girls and put all the boys on one side and all the girls on the other. Even though the room is neutral, right, they're still matched up 1 to 1. There's a definite difference now. There's a boy side and a girl side. So what's happening here is there's a side where electrons tend to go, and there's a side where they don't, even though there's the same number of pluses and minuses. So we could draw a room with pluses and minuses all sort of around it, balanced out, like this. But what can happen is because of oxygen's pull, the pluses, they don't really move. I'll put them all in the same place. But the minuses, the 5 of them, they can sort of spend more time over here by the one side. So if you count them up, it's 5 and 5. And it's not ionically charged. It's not an ion. It's neutral electrically. But you've got a negative side and a positive side, just like the boys and girls. And that's what we mean by a polar covalent bond, and it causes what's called a polar molecule. Now, why is that so critically important? They never stress this in school, at least not when I was in school. They just talk about it and they move on. This is the underpinning thing, because this polar water molecule now can do something incredibly cool. Here it is again. I'm going to draw a bunch of them, actually. Here, I'll draw one over here, and I'll draw another one over here. So imagine if we were to take something and put it in the water. Let's say we were to take some sodium chloride and put it in the water. All we did is mix them. But now something interesting happens. Remember that sodium is actually a positive ion because it gave its electron to chlorine, who became a negative. And the reason they're together is because there's a strong attraction between plus and minus. Opposites attract. But when you put them in the water, don't forget, there's also a little negative side to the water and a positive side. And that means that that side can push and pull on positive and negative things as well. So even though water is not an ion, there can be an attraction here between the positive side of the water molecule and the negative chlorine ion. And in many cases, for a lot of ionic compounds, this pull that I've drawn in red is stronger than the pull that holds the sodium and the chlorine together. And so the molecule can be pulled apart. There's also a pull here because the minus side of the water molecule can pull and tug on the sodium ion. And so what tends to happen then is the sodium ion gets pulled away and the chloride ion gets pulled away, and they get surrounded by water molecules who are attracted to them. The O side, remember, is the negative side of the water molecule. And so it's attracted to this sodium. Once it's pulled apart, they all wrap around it and prevent it from interacting with the chloride ions that happen to be over here nearby. And by the same token, the water molecules near here, remember the H side of the water molecule is the positive side. And they surround and sort of trap the chloride ion. And so we have a separation between the ions. This is the process of dissolving. It's how dissolving works, and it's so cool because it's very simple, right? There it is. But it could not work if we didn't have a polar covalent bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen, pulling on the electrons and making these interesting little poles of where the electrons are. So the neutral water molecule has sort of a positive and a negative side, which pulls on ions. This is very intriguing. And in fact, this is very important because when you pull these ions apart, they are now free to possibly interact with other ions they might bump into in the same solution. Notice something important though. When sodium and chlorine goes together, we take sodium metal, and chlorine gas, let's say, and we make NaCl, right? We make two of them like this to balance. That's not the same. These are not the same as the ions here. These ions have already done their giving and taking. The electron from sodium has already been given to chlorine to make this happen, this compound up here. And so chlorine has already got sodium's electron. When they pull apart, chlorine does not give it back. It keeps the electron. It remains a chloride ion. That's not the same as chlorine gas. So it's not like when you pull this apart, it turns into sodium metal and chlorine gas. We're not pulling them, we're not reversing the process that made this. We're simply just pulling apart the two ions that have already been made, and they do not change in their character. The sodium is still a positive ion. And that's why when you do this, this is salt, this still maintains the properties of salt. It still tastes salty. Even when you break the ions apart, they still, because they are ions still, they maintain their properties. So that's pretty amazing stuff, right? We learned another interesting thing about water, and it's related to this pushing and pulling. We learned that when two water molecules get close to each other, like this, something interesting can happen. We learned that oxygen, of course, right? So this oxygen I'm drawing in green, he's pulling these electrons away. And these poor hydrogens are feeling very left out because this is a polar covalent bond. And the electrons are always over here. And this little hydrogen here, he's like, I may as well not even have one. It's just not even fair. But over here on this oxygen, remember, there are two pairs that are not being shared. They're not involved in bonding. They're already full. But they are still negative electrons. And this little hydrogen can think, oh, if I leave this oxygen behind, I'll let him have my electron. I'll just stay H+. He can have it because he's hogging it over here anyway. And what I can do is I can sneak over here and I can sort of attach myself to this place where there are already 2 electrons, and I'll just kind of share those. Maybe the oxygen won't mind. This plus here is attracted to this minus. Remember, these little dots and lines, they're real things. They're electrons, and they're negatively charged. And so what happens is the little h pops off, and he makes this strange thing, which we call hydronium, H3O+, and leaves behind an O with an H, right? Now, why is it H3O+? Well, because this guy came along, but he didn't bring any electrons with him. He left his electron over here. He left it here with this OH, which we call hydroxide, which is minus because this O has that extra electron, right? That extra electron that it stole from hydrogen. And so now we have this in the water. And that, of course, is what, remember, I used to call it the water dance. H2O, this equilibrium bouncing back and forth. And it bounces back and forth because if one of these bumps into one of those, well, this little H that it gave right here, it might just give it back again. And so it's a constant dance where the water is giving it away in one case and giving it back in another, and they're jostling and bumping about, and we're getting hydroniums and hydroxides, but then they turn back into water, but then they bump again and they break apart, and it just continuously makes this little dance, like a square dance, where everybody's shifting partners. Okay? Now, why is that important? It's important because this is the fundamental basis for neutralizations of acids and bases. This is what makes an acid, and this is what makes a base. That's a tremendously large amount of chemistry that suddenly can come about simply because water is a polar molecule, and it can push and pull. And what we have to understand is all this pushing and pulling of electrons and where the electrons are and who can ride on who and what. This is how we get the bigger structures that can do amazingly complicated things. That's where we're headed. So we can see how these two rather complicated processes of dissolving and this acid-base interaction, these are just properties of a simple 3-atom molecule that happens to be polar in terms of its bonds. What would happen then? What are the possibilities if we go bigger? That's what we want to get at. Now, how do you make molecules bigger? Well, that's an interesting thing. So imagine if you have, I'm just going to use red, imagine you have a room, and in your bedroom, you left your Lego blocks, or your building blocks, all over the place, and they're all, some of them are stuck together, but most of them are a mess, and they're all over the room. Well, if you just leave them there and do nothing, nothing happens. But it is possible where you could take these Lego blocks and sort of clean up a little bit. Now, maybe you don't have a box to put them in. So your idea is, well, rather than just leave them strewn all over the floor, until I can find a box, what I'll do is I'll just stick them all together into one clump, right? I stick all the blocks together like this, and I put the big whole giant block in the corner. Well, that's a lot neater, isn't it? And they're not all over the place. But how did you do that? You had to expend energy. You had to do some work. In physics, we say we did work. So we changed the energy, right? You had to get up and do it using your muscles. And so what we notice from this is a very interesting concept. If you want to take a bunch of little things and squish them together into a big thing, you've got to use energy. And if you do that, we can pretend, or we can actually say, not pretend, it's real, we can say that the linking together of these, whatever it is that joins these blocks, whether, it's the little plastic nodules that interlock together, they represent the energy that we put into making this block stick together. Okay? And if we could somehow break apart, if we could reverse the process and break this apart, well, this is where the analogy breaks down a little bit. You might say, well, I would have to spend more energy to break it apart. That's not what happens in reality. In reality, things like this, they tend to break all apart on their own, slowly or quickly, depending. And so there's a tendency for nature to release energy and to go back to being little bits of blocks all over the place. That's why when you don't do anything to your room, it naturally becomes messy. Your room never naturally cleans itself up. You always need energy to clean your room, but you have to, there's no energy involved in your room becoming messy. This is a very important concept. We have a fancy name for it. We call the messiness of the room entropy. But that's a word we'll learn more about later on in grade 11 and 12. So what we can realize, though, is a very interesting relationship. Entropy is messiness or disorder. Entropy, another way to describe it, a better word than messiness, is disorder. A bunch of small things is more disordered than big things. And so what we notice is that if you take small things together and you want to reverse the entropy, you want to make them into big things that are put together like this, maybe those should be circles. If you want to stick them together, then you have to put energy in. Energy has to go in. But when big things break apart, energy comes out. It reverses the process. Energy out. And that's a very, very important concept. Things tend to go this way if they're left to their own devices. But in order to make them go this way, you've got to have a source of energy to put in. And that is a very important lesson that allows us to understand how molecules can get bigger. All right, let's see what happens here. Let's take an example of this. Let's remember a certain kind of reaction that we studied, combustion reactions. Let's look at a combustion reaction. Typically, we start with a fuel, and we add that fuel to oxygen. And then we end up getting, let me get an arrow there. We end up producing carbon dioxide and water. Well, carbon dioxide and water, those are two of the molecules we talked about right at the start. They're very simple, little molecules. But these fuels, they tend to be big, like C8, H18, or something like that. That's a big molecule. Look at those big numbers. So what we see in a combustion reaction is a big molecule that is being reacted with oxygen. But what's interesting is in the end, you have only small molecules. So it's kind of like taking the Lego block apart. We're disassembling this great big guy. We're letting him sort of fall back into smaller, more disordered things. And that's why after you give it the initial spark, the burning just goes all by itself. It just proceeds easily because it's following this path, which I said tends to be the way things go. They want to go into disorder and chaos. Keeping things ordered requires energy to go in, not energy out. This process allows energy to come out. And it's an important process. We use it to cook things and heat things, combustion. Well, now watch this. This fuel, there are lots of fuels. Here's a fuel. I'm just going to write it down. We're going to meet this fuel later on. It's a special fuel. It's a carbohydrate molecule or a kind of sugar called glucose. And it happens to be the fuel that your body runs on and that most living things run on. And if you combine this fuel with oxygen, you can combust it. It'll burn. Now, we don't do it like we do with a campfire. We don't just light a match and go, because that would obviously burn you to a crisp. We do this process in many tiny little stages. So what I'm drawing here is an overall picture, but if you zoom in on how this happens, you'll see there's 120 different steps. And each step releases energy in a very special way, and I'm going to show you. The end result, when we're all done, is we get these guys. And of course, if we were to remember our balancing, we would need 6s here to balance it all out. This is a very important combustion reaction, and it shows you a large molecule turning into a bunch of small ones, right? There are only 7 molecules on the left side if you count the oxygens, but there are 12 on the right side. So somehow they've been broken down into smaller molecules. This process, just like combustion up here, just like it releases energy, this also releases energy. The energy that somebody must have put into this molecule to stick it all together. Now, wait a minute. Who did that? Where did this glucose come from? Where did it get the energy to be all put together like that? It would be like having a box of Legos in your room, and by magic one night, you went down and they were all put together, and no one was in the house. That can't happen. Somebody had to be there. So there's something missing from this little story. How do you make this? How does this big molecule get made so that we can burn it to get the energy out of it? Well, the energy we're getting out is the energy that something else must have put in. And that leads us to how molecules can be built. So it turns out one of the ways we can build molecules is we can take the raw materials and go backwards. We can take the carbon dioxide in the water, CO2, and in fact, 6 of them. Now, there's a thing. It's called a leaf, right? Here's a nice little picture of a leaf. And the leaf has little veins in it, like this. Okay. Well, if you turn a leaf on its side and you look at it sort of from the edge, like that, it's very thin. It's like a thin sheet of paper. Now, if you zoom in on the edge and you look at what that looks like under a microscope, you'll see a fascinating picture. You'll see cells grouped like this along the top. And you'll see another group of cells all like this along underneath. Then you'll see a big spacious area, and there'll be more cells along the bottom, but there will be holes in this layer. And then there would be some cells sort of in the middle like this, branching down, but there'll be lots of gaps. It's almost like the leaf is like a giant sponge with holes in it. And then inside, you'll see very special little bundles of circles like this. And of course, this little red bundle is what we're doing is we're taking this leaf, we're laying it on its side flat, and we're cutting through it. And we're looking at the edge. So when you cut through a leaf, you cut through the veins. And this little red circle is what it looks like when you look at the vein sort of this way, edge on, the cross section of it. It's a bunch of little tubes. Now, what's interesting about this? Well, we are going to learn lots of details about this in your biology class in grade 11, but look what can happen. Oxygen and CO2 are in the air. CO2 can flow in here, right in the hole, and it can get very close to all these cells inside. It can flow in the holes. And likewise, any gases that might be inside, let's say there's oxygen in here, it might go out the hole very easily. So the leaf has a way of actually breathing. It has a way of exchanging gas. It can let carbon dioxide come in close to its cells, and it can let oxygen go out very easily. It doesn't have lungs, but that's what leaves do. So you can see how a leaf can take basic building blocks. Now the other thing that happens is water, H2O, gets absorbed by the roots, goes all the way up the tree and out into the leaf, and it goes through these veins, and it pops out of those little things here, and it comes out like this. Here's water. So now the cells have a fresh supply of CO2 and a fresh supply of water. Whoops, what did I do? I pressed the wrong button. I think I better go back here. A fresh supply of water, H2O. There we go. So see, look, here are the building blocks. CO2 and oxygen and CO. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, my mistake. Did I write that upside down here? Oh, I did. Oh, I feel so terrible now, having to go back. You're probably all wondering why I said water here. I put O2 by mistake. Oh, and it's too late to restart the video. So we'll have to correct that. The products of a combustion reaction are water and carbon dioxide. I think I said water, but I wrote O2 by mistake. So it's water that's on this side. Now that we correct that, we can take this product here. We're taking carbon dioxide and water. We're working backwards. That's embarrassing. But sometimes happens when you're working live, right? You just carry on. So here they are. This is what I meant. There's carbon dioxide and there's water that are now available to the plant. Okay? So now, what can the plant do with that? Well, the plant can reverse the process. The plant can build, let me erase this now. The plant can build glucose. It can take these Legos on the side, and it can build them into C6H12O6. And of course, oxygen gas. So it's the exact opposite process. But the plant cannot do this alone. Okay, that's the catch. I don't know why this is so fussy today. Okay, there's the combustion reaction. So we're kind of working this reaction backwards. But the plant cannot do it alone. In order for it to do this, since you're now making a bigger molecule out of small ones, energy has to go in. And where does that energy come from? Well, the plant has a special molecule called chlorophyll that can capture the energy of sunlight, sort of like a solar panel. And so we have energy coming in the form of sunlight. Sunlight is necessary for this to happen because it won't happen unless energy can be added to the process. And so the building of a bigger molecule, where did that glucose come from that we burned to get our energy? So the energy starts with the sun. It goes into plants and gets stored and gets built as glucose, which is this fuel. But then the plants can be eaten by animals to get the glucose, and then we turn it back into H2O and CO2, right? This is what the animals do. And actually plants do this too. Well, one of the funny things we tend to learn is, we forget that plants don't make sugar for us. They make it for themselves, and they also will break it apart. So animals and plants together will run the reaction, the first reaction that we had before, but then it'll go back again as long as the sunlight keeps adding into the mix. So maybe it's better to put the arrow there. There's sunlight that keeps recharging and keeps giving us the ability to build this large molecule. It's like the effort it takes you to build your Legos, to clean them up. So that's a very important thing. Energy can cause atoms to be built into bigger and bigger atoms. Okay, so that's where we're going to go in our next video. We're going to talk about how we get bigger and bigger atoms. But remember, they all require energy. Without the sun giving a constant input of energy, plants would not be able to make this glucose, and then we would not be able to use it up here. We would not be able to use it. Oh, come on, smartboard. I don't know if it's my computer. We would not be able to use that energy in order to, I don't know what's happening. I can't seem to move this anymore. Oh well. Let me see if I can do it with the computer instead of my finger. There we go. Yeah, it's all over the place, isn't it? Well, it's not going to work, but you get the idea. You remember that we use the glucose in order to... Oh, now it's going to work. Where are we? Here we go. Here we go, right here. See, we burned the glucose to get the energy. So where did it come from? Plants made it. And where did they get the energy to make it? From the sun. Very important. And then, of course, we'll see in our next video how we get bigger and bigger molecules. And then how these molecules can be used to then build even bigger structures like the components of cells, membranes, and nucleuses, and ribosomes, and all these kinds of things, which can then do even more amazing things. If we thought water was amazing with its 3 atoms, imagine what molecules like proteins can do with their hundreds and hundreds of atoms. So we'll get to that in the next video.